Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly and I'm a mixed media artist who specializes in gouache paint, ink work, and sometimes I do digital painting. In this week's video, I'm going to be showing you my process on painting this glowing mushroom. Now in the previous video with this painting, I did the whole color blocking stage, and now I'm in the stage where I'm like, all right, we're blending out some things, we're getting a little bit more detailed, until each subject in the painting is pretty much done. When everything's about 90% done, then that's the fun part where you go back in and you do the really fine details, the things that really crisp up the image, that make it go from a good painting to a great painting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So for now, what we're doing is making the mushroom into an actual mushroom and not just a bunch of color splotches thrown together in some sort of puzzle arrangement. I'm using a damp brush a lot, where I just get my brush. I typically use a brush that's been used too much, like to the point where it's frayed. It looks like it went through a garbage disposal. That's the kind of brush I'm talking. I think most of us have that brush. If you know, you know. I put that in my cup of water. I blot it on each side on a paper towel, and then it's ready for blending. You don't want too much water because it'll either leave watermarks on your painting, or it could even leak a giant water drop. You don't want that either because gouache revives with water. So you want it to be almost dry, but just a little bit damp. And then I'm going back and forth across these grooves within the mushroom gills to create more of like an organic texture that you would expect from underneath a mushroom. And I did find out, by the way, last video I said that they were mushroom gills, and I kind of second guessed myself and thought I kind of made that up, but no, it's not the scientific term, but they are referred to as gills. So I'm going in between each of these grooves, creating a shadow with a lot of Prussian blue. I love Prussian blue for shadows, especially in a nighttime scene like this, because it's a more desaturated blue, which is great for shadows. And I'm blending that underneath the little ruffle skirt thing. I need to I keep forgetting what that thing is called, but I call it the skirt on a mushroom where those frills kind of come out. And I'm also putting that Prussian blue in between the gills, focusing on the very most inner part of the cap where it's condensed, where the stem is growing out of. And I'm also bringing that Prussian blue to the outer ring underneath there. Then what I'm doing is taking my damp brush, and with my brush from each direction, from inside the ring and outside the ring, I'm flicking it inwards and outwards to create those gills. And what this does is create a nice taper to my paint line, and that creates that look of gills. As you can see, there's a lot of blending involved, but something I did want to point out to you is that I did use Prussian blue in a lot of the outer portion of the mushroom cap. So not the part that's glowing, but the top part where it's kind of slate gray blue looking. I used a lot of Prussian blue for that core shadow that's around the outer rim of the mushroom, as well as some Prussian blue mixed with titanium white gouache paint for the moonlight in the background that's hitting the top of the mushroom. I began including a lot of the lighter green color that I had mixed together as the ambient glowing light emitting from the mushroom. So I'm just layering that onto the background and onto any surroundings in the painting to really make it look like it's glowing in the dark. You may also be wondering why there's a bunch of circles of that same green color all around the background. I wanted it to look like spirit orbs or like floating energy or even just dust. I don't know what they're supposed to be. I like to think they're more like spirit orbs, but the effect I'm going for is when you see a ray of light and a bunch of particles in the air are kind of floating around. If you took a picture of that, the camera picks it up as this kind of glowing orb situation. That's what I wanted to convey. I will be blending out those circles later. They're just placeholders for now. As you can see, I'm lightly painting over the negative space I left for the dewdrops on the spiderwebs and the spiderweb threads themselves. I left them blank because I wanted to still be able to see them, but also I left them blank because then I can add a transparent film of the background color and any of the ambient lighting colors as well as just the base coat for that area. Later on, I'm going to be using a lot of white to actually etch those out and make them look realistic and like they're glistening with dewdrops, and you can see the light kind of bouncing off of the threads. But for now, I'm just using watercolor with that black and Prussian blue background mixture, as well as some of that light green mixture, and really watering it down to be transparent over that whole area. That way I can still identify where I'm even going to be painting, but also it's going to work as part of the effect I'm trying to achieve, because they're going to, if you think of a spider web, it's very transparent, as well as water and dewdrops. So it's going to have a glass-like kind of consistency. I'm going to be painting a lot of abstract shapes to show the reflections of the surrounding light and atmosphere. So the shading is very difficult when you're trying to describe something that is glowing. In this case, in my reference photo, you could see a lot of shading focused on the gills that were fanning out towards the viewer, and then more of that glowing effect is happening towards the gills that are receding into the background away from the viewer behind the stem. And I think part of this is because the closer you are to the gills, you're going to see more of that detail. You're going to see each and every single individual little ruffle thingy under there, right? And then as it recedes back, things tend to blur with depth of field. Therefore, the light will overexpose it and kind of take over all of those deeper shadows. So I'm focusing more of that contrast and detail on the gills that are closer to the viewer and less detail towards subjects that are receding into the background, away from the viewer. Later on, I think pretty soon in the footage, you will see that I end up getting a new pigment that is a lot more vibrant. I end up including that in a lot of the pre-established details I already painted in. At this point, I felt like the mushroom looked really close to being done, but I just wasn't happy with how muted the green was. Usually, like really muted colors. I'm not a person that loves bright colors typically, but this painting I felt like it would read more like it's a glowing mushroom if it's that iconic, glowing, vibrant green. So I wound up going in with some vibrant green color to tint a lot of the areas that I have already carved out with pre-existing gouache paint. So even though I took a little bit of a detour in the painting, I am really glad I decided to add that layer of green on top anyways. It just looks a lot more kind of radioactive, which is, I mean, not the aesthetic I'm going for, but it's definitely the color. Think of uranium glass, you know? I definitely want that kind of glow-in-the-dark color. And I think that this watercolor tint I placed on top totally gave it that punch of saturation it needed, and it took it from being this muted sage green to being more in-your-face green, which I love. I also feel like it worked really well because whenever I place watercolor on top of gouache, and when I do it carefully, you don't want to mix it too aggressively because it'll, of course, we already discussed this in many videos. If you aggressively scrub, you're going to revive all the paint layers underneath because gouache revives with water, right? But if you layer it on top and kind of float it on top gently, it acts like a tint. It's kind of like what I do with my watercolor pencils, except it's a lot more opaque and comes with a little bit more commitment. But that's all right. I'm committed to this. I think this looks good. I also love how it contrasts with that desaturated blue as the shadow. I think that the shifts in saturation give it so much more depth as well. And you do still see some of that muted green peeking through in some places. So all that work I previously did wasn't completely for nothing. At the end of the day, I'm glad I chose to layer this on top. At this point, I'm using a damp brush with some of the paint blotted off to create higher points of highlights. I'm using titanium white gouache paint here, and I'm lightly blending that in to kind of revive a little bit of that green underneath. That way, it's not purely white, it still has a little bit of green in it. I like doing this because I feel like you get more of a seamless highlight rather than mixing the color beforehand and applying it on, and then you had to really feather out all the edges of the areas you applied the paint. I just like going in with a damp brush with a little bit of white paint and it just blends right in. I'm also taking a bit of that really vibrant green watercolor that I used earlier to tint the whole mushroom underneath, and I'm applying that in areas around the rim of the mushroom cap that would catch a rim light. Something to note here, that rim light, I'm making the edge appear like it's cracked in some spots and curled under or rippled a little bit because this is an organic object that was grown. It's not a manufactured perfect mushroom disc, and I feel like irregular edges like that really convey that a lot better. The first layer of that rim light, I blurred it out quite a bit to give a sense of form and roundness, like the edge of the mushroom is curling underneath itself. And then as that dries, I'm doing other layers that are more precise with more of that green watercolor to give a more pigmented gradient from that very edge, and then as it slopes up, it's a lot more gradual. Alright, well that's pretty much the process. This is the glowing mushroom, the big one anyway, that is part of my mushroom fairy painting. This piece is for Game of Shrooms this year. I will be making prints of it and I will be hiding it around my local area that I signed up for. If you're in Washington State and you're participating in Game of Shrooms, definitely check out my Instagram. I'll be posting around June 8th all of the little hints where I'm hiding my prints so you can go and find them. Alright, well if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing. And I'll see you next week. Bye!